a white animation appears with words coming in from different directions that reads, National Council on Independent Living, Oral History Project, interview with former Nickel director Kelly Buckland.
Boise, Idaho got their first grant to form a Center for Independent Living. So I went to work for the Center for Independent Living in 1989. And I came back to my first Nickel conference that same year. So that was my introduction to Nickel. And Mark Abristo was the chairman or the president of Nickel at that time. And we really I think they were only kind of like contracting with with consultants versus actually having staff at the time. So that was right when we were trying to get the ADA passed. So it was 1989. So trying to get the White House support for the ADA was something Nickel was trying to do that year. And so we actually did a march on the White House. All the Nickel people did. I don't remember how many people there were back then, but we marched from the hotel that we were in. Well, we marched from this metro stop that we were at, because we were actually meeting in Bethesda, I believe. Rode the metro into DC and then marched to the White House. It was pouring rain. I mean, it was dumping rain. So, power wheelchairs and people with disabilities don't mix too well in the rain, but we all put on these black trash bags as raincoats, because nobody had a raincoat or an umbrella back then. And we marched on the White House, and I remember this clearly because it was so funny. You think about it in terms of today, nothing like this could happen, right? Because the security was so much more lax back then. I mean, Mark, those little sort of like fort-like things that are by the used to be by the White House. Some of them are still there at the corner of the lawn. So they had telephones in, and Mark had just wheeled up to one of them and picked the phone up. And somebody answered, and she said, I want to speak to the president. And they said, well, hold on a minute. And then somebody came back to the phone, and it was the Attorney General. It was Thornburg, who was Attorney General back at the time. And so he actually arranged a meeting. Like, we were all out there in the rain. I mean, they knew we were there, right? So they knew it wasn't just Markup. It was a bunch of us out there. So they arranged a meeting with the White House the next day, with the president the next day. See what I mean? Like, that could not happen today. They actually wanted me to go, apparently, but by the time I found out, and I don't know why. I mean, I was a newbie, so I was really surprised by the whole thing, but I couldn't get my information through clearance quick enough by the time I found out they wanted me to go, it was kind of too late. So they went and they had a meeting with the president. Thornburg had a child with a disability, with a developmental disability. And so Dick Thornburg actually was the one who who convinced the president to get on board with the Americans with Disabilities Act. But that was my first involvement with Nickel. So what it should tell you is Nickel has a really long history of doing advocacy, like on the highest level, to get this kind of stuff done. And so, I mean, obviously I came to every Nickel conference after that, because it's a way to get really pumped up. When you're back in your own state, you're fighting all this stuff. It's sort of demoralizing to the number of walls you come up against. And so it was really like helpful for the morale and just your spirit, your fire in the belly kind of thing, to come to Nickel conference. So people came back here to get recharged and like go after it again back in their homes. Also doing some, national level advocacy while we're here, which is part of why you get pumped up. But I think the march has been a thing ever since, because Nickel does an annual march, and I think I don't know for sure that was the genesis, but I think so, for that annual march. So anyway, and then come to find out later, there was a guy from Idaho who actually was on the original Nickel board. He was a guy I knew had severe cerebral palsy. His name was Bob Quinn. And Bob had worked for the center in Pocatello, Idaho, that was the first funded center for independent living and independently funded center for independent living. There were grants that went to VR, and basically the VR agency in the state had the first right of refusal on back then on the independent living grants. And so they didn't take up the opportunity for that money. And so a consumer group did, and that's what started the Independent Living Center up in Pocatello, which back then was called CRIP. It stood for the Center for Resources for Independent People. Very controversial name because it included CRIP, or the acronym spelled CRIP. CRIP was a bad word. So anyway, it was very controversial, but they kept with the name for a really long time. But anyway, so I came back to Nickel every year, and in 1992, the Rehab Act changed to include state independent living councils. Well, I helped organize the original SILC in Idaho, so I was the center director, and we understood what the 92 amendments meant and how much more autonomy that gave to the SILCs. And so I stayed involved in Nickel a lot just to try to help become educated about what the law actually did and meant too, right? So I was very familiar with it, so that's why I helped organize the SILC in Idaho. But then it was shortly after that, and I can't tell you what year for sure, there was a bunch of discussions going on within Nickel and in the state independent living councils that the state independent living councils wanted to form their own association. I personally was opposed to that because we didn't need another disability organization to represent us in DC. That's what Nickel did. That's why we paid dues to Nickel, was to have Nickel do that. We didn't need another organization just for SILCs. I didn't believe. A lot of people disagreed with me, but a lot more of them agreed. And so they remained members of Nickel. One of the criticisms of Nickel was that SILC directors couldn't serve on the board. And I was like, well, sure they can. So there was a provision in the rules that basically said that you could get elected to the board to represent the Center for Independent Living, and you didn't necessarily need to be an employee of that center. It was whoever the center wanted to pick. So I got the Idaho centers to pick me, and I got elected to the board of Nickel just to show you could do it. That's really the only reason I did it, was just to prove that you could do it if you wanted to. If you wanted to serve on the board, you could. Well, I think like shortly after that, about 5 other SILC directors got elected to the board. So there was Ann McDaniel, there was Shannon Jones, there was me, there was Pat Puckett. There was a number of us that sat on the board. So this whole argument that you couldn't sit on the board was proven to not be true. So that we sort of held off this separate SILC association in abeyance because we showed that. Well, somebody then, like, I think I served 2 terms on the board, like two 2-year terms on the board, I believe. And then actually I was like a regional rep, was what I got elected to. Then somebody asked me to run as vice president. So I did that, and I got elected. And so I served, what is it, two-year terms, so 4 years as the vice president. Then they wanted me to run for the president. And remember, this is all fluke because I just ran to show you could, right? So then I got elected as the president, and I served 2 4-year terms as president. And I was committee chairs for a number of the committees too. I was the Rehab Act committee chair for a while. Bob Michaels asked me to take over for him. And then John Lancaster, the director we had at the time, was leaving, and he kind of put muscle on me to become the new director. And I was like, look, I don't want to be the director of NCIL. I love Idaho. I want to stay in Idaho. I've got like 5 more years before I can retire from the state. And if I move to NCIL, it's going to be 10 years before I can retire. And so, but eventually I wanted to come back to NCIL anyway, because I really respected NCIL as an organization. It wasn't that. In fact, I loved NCIL. Lots of people were in love with NCIL. It wasn't like something we did because there wasn't anybody else to do it or whatever. It really was. You loved the organization. You loved the advocacy that they did. Everybody really loved NCIL because NCIL was their voice. And so it wasn't that. It's just like I was just trying to think of my own personal situation. I had a young son and house, and I was all established in Idaho. So, but I came back to do it and ended up being NCIL executive director for 12 years. So I've got 20 years just on NCIL leadership, right? I was on the board, then I was vice president for 4, president for 4. So that's at least 10 years on the board. And then I became the director for 12. So I've got like over 20 years in leadership at NCIL, which is why I retired. I just sort of I didn't really retire, but I retired off the NCIL board because I just felt like that's long enough. They needed somebody new, right? They needed somebody to come in with some fresh ideas and some more connection to the younger generation. I was really hoping it would be somebody of color because being an old white male, NCIL needed more diversity, and it needed diversity at the highest levels, the board chair, the executive director, those kinds of things. So I was really, my wife died a couple of years prior, and so it just felt like it was the time to turn NCIL over to somebody else. So I informed the board I intended on. I actually gave them 2 years notice. Like, I'm planning on moving on, so you guys should start doing some planning for hiring a new executive director. I wanted to have time to really think it through, to do a thorough search, find somebody who was really right for the job. That was the intent behind giving it 2 years to find somebody. So anyway, that's kind of in a nutshell, that's my history with NCIL.
A white card appears which reads, "How would you describe the major changes to NCIL from the time of its founding up until today?"
Well, I think that we went through a lot of changes based on cultural changes. But otherwise, I mean, I think it was really sort of the same except it grew, it got bigger. I mean, like we were contract staff where we had contract staff when I went to the first meeting. When I left as executive director, we owned an entire floor of an office building. Nickel occupied the whole floor, had 10 employees. Very low turnover rate. So, which in the past had not been true. There was like quite a bit of turnover because frankly, we weren't paying people enough. So they weren't staying. So we needed to do things that would keep people there. So increased wages and increased benefits and really kind of trying to give people a reason to be there for a long time. Because, like I said, everybody loved Nickel. So it wasn't that they weren't working there because they didn't like it and they weren't fully committed to the mission of Nickel. It was just people had to make a living. So
Sure.
They moved on. So what we tried to do was like really transform it into a organization that had numerous staff because we were growing. Our membership was growing and our presence was growing, and so we needed more staff. Part of that was hiring a resource development person. That actually happened before I got there. Well, I mean, before I got there as the director. So to bring resources in, I mean, as long as it was with Nickel's mission, we were certainly happy to take more money and tried to keep the dues the same so that centers didn't have to pay more money. But because centers all had really small budgets that were strapped anyway, like paying Nickel dues wasn't something we wanted to burden them with anymore. So we really tried to keep the dues the same, but build the organization. So that's, I think, was the biggest transformation was really just having a bigger presence here, more staff, a location where people knew where we were. We were 2 blocks away from the White House, not that far from Congress, so we could really be busy on the Hill. And I think if other people probably disagree, and there was a lot of people who made this happen, but I believe Nickel was the leader organization that saved the Affordable Care Act last time. Like I say, there was a lot of different people made that happen, and a lot of different organizations. And if it hadn't have been for us having a coalition of a lot of different organizations, we probably wouldn't have saved it, but we did. And I think you can talk to anybody, and it was the disability movement that stopped the repeal and replace of the Affordable Care Act. The reason I give Nickel a lot of credit was because we were in town for our annual conference. We had 2,000 people show up, or close to that, for the conference itself. So that's the other thing. Like I would guess that first Nickel meeting, there was like a couple hundred people, and it grew into like 2,000. Or at least every year we were getting at least 1,000 people coming to the conference. So it, increased from a couple hundred to 1,000 over. And then we opened the march up to other organizations, and we invited them not to the conference because there was a fee to attend the conference, but to join in the march. We just made it a blanket invitation. Anybody who wanted to come to the march was welcome. And so we had about 2,000, 2,500 that year that joined the march. So it was a big march. And instead of just forming for a rally at the Capitol building, which is what we typically done, but there were certain years there was an advocacy issue on the agenda that was important enough that we would direct the march into like basically a real like civil disobedience kind of an action, which is what we did that year. So we basically there was a lot of different advocacy that happened before that, adapt, and several Nickel staff got arrested in the Capitol Dome. I think there was 25 of us, maybe more than that, got arrested in the Dome. But then the big march, we took over the Hart Building. And if you've ever been in that Hart Building, it like echoes when you yell in there, it just echoes. And so we had about 600 people in the Hart Building shouting different kinds of slogans, like our homes, not nursing homes. I mean, because that's partly what the Affordable Care Act would have done, is put people in nursing homes, or the repeal of it would have done. So there's like 500 or 600 people, and they're making all that noise. I actually ended up having a meeting with Tammy Duckworth that same time. So I had to leave that demonstration and go up to her office to meet with her, and you could hear it in her conference room. I mean, and then there were people that came out of the offices and hung over the rails that go around the building so you can see down into the main floor. And a lot of the employees came out there and joined into the yelling and shouting and the protests around trying to repeal the act. And so I know for a fact that the senator from Arizona, McCain, heard that and had to walk through it. And they voted that same night. So that was fresh in his mind. And I'm sure that played a real important part of his making up his decision about how he was going to vote. So I think that's why I give Nickel a lot of credit, because we just kind of serendipitously was there. But anyway, so hopefully it's going to survive this attack too, but I'm not sure. I think the thing that really felt different about Nickel was Nickel wasn't, even though when I left there, we had a presence on the Hill. That's never been Nickel's strength. Like we didn't want it to be. We didn't want to be just another DC organization. We wanted to be driven by the grassroots. We wanted to be, our policy formation was at the grassroots level. They told us what to do. They told us what the priorities were going to be. They told Nickel what things we were going to work on. And it didn't come from the director down. It was the opposite way. It was like the centers, the SILCs, and people with disabilities in general were telling us what the policy issues were. So having a march in DC where you actually can make some of that change, it's very empowering. And I think the other thing that's overwhelming to me, beyond the White House march, was I came back to DC, came into this hotel, and there's people with disabilities everywhere. I mean, we took the hotel over. It was like, that wasn't the way it worked back then. There were people with disabilities were out very infrequently. In your old community, you hardly ever saw anybody else with a disability. And if you did, there was like maybe 5 or 10 people that you knew in the entire state. And so to come back here and see like hundreds of people with disabilities in this hotel, not only there, but there proudly, was really a thing back. People didn't, believe, before the ADA, things were like way different. We got kicked out of places just for being disabled. I got kicked out of movie theaters, told I was a fire hazard, couldn't sit in the aisle. But of course, there was no one else to sit. So they just kick you out of the movie. I kicked out of restaurants because you were in the way of the wait staff. Like, there was nothing you could do about it. There was no law. There was no anything that protected your rights. So, there weren't even ramps or curb cuts or parking space. I mean, they were sort of starting to appear at that point, but nothing like you see today. So it was a completely different environment. So to come back here and to see all these people with disabilities who somehow got here and are now staying in a hotel and it's basically taking it over, because it was hard to like swing a dead cat, as they say, and not hit somebody with a disability. So that was a completely different experience than what you experienced in your hometown. So that was probably more empowering to me than the whole March on the White House. I mean, that was a cool thing, don't get me wrong. That was really an important part of history and how the ADA became the ADA. But at the same time, it was all that other stuff that really was more emotionally overwhelming. It was really we just got larger. We never really, we transformed by continuing to do the same stuff, right? Had a march every year. We always had issues to work on. There were always access issues, still are. The world's a much better place, but it's still got a long ways to go. After that bill passed in 1985, the handicapped and elderly voting accessibility bill, to HAVA, the Help America Vote Act, Civil Rights Act, all of those things made it easier to vote, but there were still a lot of barriers people with disabilities were hitting up against. A lot of times the ballot marking devices weren't working, or the polling place was still inaccessible, you couldn't get in. So we were pretty heavily working on FEMA and emergency management stuff and voting rights. And so I think that if you think about evolution or the changing of nickel, it was really kind of that. What were the policy issues that we were trying to achieve at the time? But I did want to see a new face, a new energy come in with a new agenda. So we were an advocacy organization that was focused on working with Congress and the administration on behalf of our membership, which is the senators and SILCs, and people with disabilities, to make disability policy better so that people could basically live, work, and play like people without disabilities. Like I said, I think the strength of nickel has always been its grassroots. We used to basically tout that we had a center in every congressional district. And I think they still do. I think there still are centers for independent living in every single congressional district, which means that you can influence every congressional district. But, during this time, disability rights have taken so many hits. We've gone so far backward. Even on doing stuff that was just done in the last administration to give people, personally for me, working on accessible air travel and getting that rule finalized, the Flying with Dignity rule, was a big deal because people are afraid to fly. I mean, they're literally afraid for their lives to get on an airplane. And it shouldn't be that way, but now we're headed back in the same direction with how this administration is going to now enforce the rule that's on the books, and probably will take efforts to try to overturn it. But dismantling special education and Department of Ed, taking down all of the DEIA stuff, which in DEIA, the A is for accessibility. So they're dismantling so much stuff that has taken years to gain. Unfortunately, the next era on disability and independent living is going to have to fight a lot of the same battles we fought just to get back where we were. There's a lot of really good disability rights organizations in DC. The difference is they don't have the same connection to the grassroots that Centers or Nickel does. I think it still remains the only national disability rights organization that is primarily made up of people with disabilities. It's the largest anyway. AAPD can make the same charge that they're made up of people with disabilities too, but they don't have that connection to the grassroots that Nickel did. And that's why we always used to tout those two things. It's the largest, the only, but it's the largest organization ran by and for people with disabilities.